So it is believed, although it was never tested or proven, that her owner, John, was also her biological father as well. So, hello, welcome to week 9 of Mix It Up, Black History in the Restoration. I'm Taylor Ricks, and this is where we mix up a recipe while we mix up the Restoration by learning about early members of the church who were of African American descent. Today, we are going to mix up some chocolate chip cookies because they're my favorite and it's my birthday. Okay. We're mixing up chocolate chip cookies because they're my favorite and it's my birthday. So that's the treat for today. And please tell me I'm not the only one that has like 5 recipes for chocolate chip cookies, and depending on the mood, depends on which recipe I use. I'm a little crazy. And then we're also going to learn about Marinda Bankhead today. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Marinda Bankhead, she was born in October in 1831, and she was born as a slave. And she was owned by John and Elizabeth Redd. And they lived in North Carolina, and the way the family kind of came about, now I have to be a little honest, this week is a little bit scandalous, so be prepared for that. But it also is kind of an eye-opener into what slavery really did look like in the 1800s for many people. So Elizabeth Redd, you'll remember, is Marinda's owner. She inherited, before she was married, 2 slaves by the name of Venus and Cheney. And when she got married to her husband, John, she brought those 2 slaves into the marriage. And it is believed that, well, it's actually known through DNA testing that Elizabeth's husband, John, actually fathered the child of Venus, so one of the slaves. He fathered the son. And we know that because DNA testing was done later on. So, no DNA testing was done for the slave by the name of Cheney, but there's family records that suggest Cheney's daughter Amy, are you following me? I need a family tree. Cheney's daughter Amy was also fathered by John, the slave owner, and Cheney is said to be Marinda, who we're speaking about today, her mom. And Marinda, all the records about her lists her as yellow. So that is another derogatory term that was used to talk about people of mixed descent. So it is believed, although it was never tested or proven, that her owner, John, was also her biological father as well. So we don't know for sure, but that is what is believed by some of the family records and other historians. So she was born under some kind of dubious, obviously, circumstances. If he isn't her father, we're not sure who is. Well, after a few years in 1838, remember she was born in 1831, so when she was around 7 years old, the family moved to Tennessee. And a little while after moving to Tennessee, they were taught the gospel by John D. Lee, who was a missionary of the 70 at the time. And the whole Redd family was baptized, including Venus and Cheney. And Marinda was old enough to get baptized, but she chose not to get baptized at that point. So it was just the rest of the family that did. So years later, in 1850, the family traveled to the Salt Lake Valley with the James Pace Company. And they settled there, and eventually, after arriving in the Salt Lake Valley, they were sent to settle Spanish Fork. So the 6 slaves that they owned and their family, the Redd family, all moved to settle in Spanish Fork. Okay, we're gonna mix it up a little bit. So after settling in Spanish Fork, and 2 years after they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, Marinda was 20 years old, and that is when she chose to get baptized for the first time. Many members of her family got baptized for the second time, including Cheney, who we believe to be her mom, and Venus. So they got baptized again to show their commitment to the gospel as Cheney was baptized as Miranda was baptized for the first time. A couple of years later, her owner, John, passed away, and in his will, he left his inheritance to many of his slaves, including Marinda. So court records show that Marinda, because of that, went to try and go get freedom or become emancipated, but the courts did not recognize that. However, the estate of John did, I made a big mess like last week. The estate of John did recognize the will and did give the things to Miranda that she was promised. That includes the home that was shared with their 6 slaves, and they lived there together. And so by them essentially honoring that will and still allowing them to have the things that were promised to them by the slave owner, it acknowledged the fact that they were in many ways emancipated, even though the paperwork didn't reflect their emancipation. Okay, so that brings us to the 1860s, which turned out to be a really challenging time for Miranda. I'm sorry, I don't know which way she pronounces it, Miranda or Marinda. During that time, Miranda birthed 2 children, 2 sons, to 2 different white members of the church out of wedlock. The oldest son was the name David William Pace, but he went by Billy Pace, and her other son, Edward T. Dennis. And her actions led a man by the name of Albert King Tuber to come preach against race mixing, and what he said is whoredom. So he came to the area and gave 2 talks that talked about it being inappropriate to mix races and obviously to have children out of wedlock, as a result, in part, to Miranda's 2 children being born during that time. So not only was she going through a hard time, but she also experienced some public ridicule through all of that. And I do know that some of those things were said because I have had some of those things quoted back to me. As many of you know, like, I am in a mixed race marriage, and I've had people quote back to me that those marriages are inappropriate or unfounded by God because of the mix of our races. However, that is not doctrine. It's not what we teach now, and so I'm so grateful for that because it opened the pathway for my family. But my heart breaks for Miranda because I cannot imagine what it was like to be both a single mom, but then also feeling a little bit ostracized in her community instead of welcomed and loved and fellowshipped. So the 1870s turned around a little bit for Miranda. She met and married her now husband, Alex Bankhead, and we're gonna mix a little more. Okay, so she married Alex Bankhead in 1870, and together they raised her son Billy. You'll remember I also shared that she had a son during that time by the name of Edward. Edward passed away as an infant. He did not reach his first birthday, so among all of that, she also lost a child. And so together, though, they raised Billy, and that's the only child I know of. I do know that there are other ancestors down the Bankhead line that we're going to talk about in coming weeks. So I like big cookies around here. So she and Alex lived on the farm, and with all that was left to her when her owner died, they were able to eventually gain a 20-acre farm, and they became quite lucrative in the Spanish Fork area. as Billy grew, he decided to move back to the Salt Lake area. And there, because his mom was mixed race and then he was mixed race, he was very fair skinned. So when he moved to Salt Lake, he adopted the identity of being Caucasian, and he lived by his birth father's last name there. And we have no record of him actually getting baptized. But Miranda and Alex lived for a long time, and a lot of people in the Spanish Fork Valley until they died. And a lot of people would call her Aunt Rindy. They talked about times that she would bring bread to their home, that she was super faithful and helpful in her Relief Society organization. People also talked about Alex and said that he was an excellent farmer and that they were both incredibly faithful and devout. So they lived there relatively happily for a long time. In 1907, Miranda passed away, and she passed away 5 years after her husband did from breast cancer. She did receive a double mastectomy in an effort to treat her cancer, but in the end her cancer was the thing that did end her life. And she is buried now next to her husband in the Spanish Fork Cemetery, where a lot of pioneers are buried. And on their cemetery, their headstone marker, it's been engraved that their ceiling work was completed in 1991, however, in the Provo Temple. However, church records indicate that their ceiling was actually completed in 1984 in the Provo Temple. And it is such an amazing blessing to see that these families are absolutely united forever, and that their sacrifices were not in vain. I am so grateful for Miranda's example in my life, her willingness to persevere, to overcome her trials, her hardship, her sins, and to return to the gospel so that we could be talking about her today and learning from her beautiful testimony and example. I can't wait to meet Miranda in the next life. So we have these giant cookies. They cook for like 20 minutes. And thank you so much for coming to week 9. Mix It Up, Black History and the Restoration. And I can't wait to see you again next week. Goodbye.